أهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. قبل 400 عام عرف دبلوماسي بريطاني السفير على أنه رجل أمين يوفد إلى الخارج ليكذب من أجل مصلحة بلاده. على بعد آلاف الأميال من أرض الوطن يكون السفير هو الممثل الشخصي لزعيم بلاده. ربما يبدو وكانه يتحدث نيابة عن نفسه، ولكن الكلمات التي يتفوه بها تمثل كلمات ملك بلاده أو رئيسها أو رئيس وزرائها. إنها ليست مهمة سهلة. تتزايد صعوبة الأمر حين لا يتفق السفير مع سياسة حكومته. كان ذلك هو الحال مع روبرت فورد، الدبلوماسي المرموق الذي خدم البلاد في بعض من أخطار الدول حول العالم. كان رجلنا في دمشق حين بدأت الثورة السورية. على مر الوقت تزايد إخباته لكون واشنطن لا تفعل ما يكفي لدعم الثوار وللوفاء بالتزام أمريكا الخاص نحو الحرية للشعب السوري. فترك الحكومة وهو شيء كلما يفعله الدبلوماسيون. اليوم في برنامج داخل واشنطن نتحدث حول الجوانب السياسية الدبلوماسية مع الدبلوماسي الأمريكي روبرت فورد. Welcome back to Dakhil, Washington. I'm sitting here with Ambassador Robert Ford. Robert, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Nice to see you.
Syria, the worst humanitarian crisis of our lifetime, says the United Nations. How would you characterize this country today? Is it one, two, split, divided? How would you describe it?
I think, first of all, Rob, it's a human tragedy of gigantic proportion, certainly the worst we've seen maybe in 30 or 40 years, and getting worse, not getting better. It's winter now in Syria and Lebanon, Turkey, and little children are freezing to death. There are heart-wrenching pictures of little children that have frozen to death. It's very, very sad. On a political level, I think Syria, in the middle of this civil war, is little by little being divided into different pieces. There's a part that the Syrian Kurds control in the northeast. There's a part that the Syrian government controls around Damascus and the Mediterranean coast. There's a part that Daesh, the Islamic State, controls in the east. And then there's a part that everybody's fighting over around Aleppo and Idlib. And the country is little by little being divided into pieces.
When people here in the United States look at Syria today, they forget that this rebellion started in a very different environment, in a very different way. You were there.
Yes.
How did it start? What was it like in the early days of the uprising against the regime?
Yeah. Well, I arrived in Damascus at the end of January 2011, and 2 weeks later was the first demonstration in what became the Syrian uprising. It was in a market in Damascus called El Hari'a. And it's called El Hari'a, which means burning in Arabic, because in the fighting against the French in 1923, French planes had hit that market and burned it down. So, but in this first demonstration in the middle of February, a motorist received conflicting traffic instructions from two different traffic policemen, and because he wasn't sure what to do, he stopped. And so one of the policemen came over and beat him. And a crowd saw this, and spontaneously several hundred, maybe 1,000 people gathered shouting, "Ashab Suri ma bienzil," the Syrian people will not be humiliated. And the interior minister at the time came from his office and went down to El Hari'a and said, "Please, no violence. We will punish the police officer who did this. We will release the arrested motorist, and this will be taken care of." And the crowd dispersed. That was 3 weeks before the first demonstrations in Daraa, which again came as a result of police brutality, where police arrested some teenagers for spraying on the walls what they'd seen on Arabic satellite television stations from Egypt, from Tunisia, from Yemen, Isqat and Nizam, bring down the regime. And the children were abused in detention, and their parents and their neighbors came out and demonstrated. But all of that started as a result of police brutality. Now in Dara, Rob, in March, there was some violence. I mean, we have to be honest about that. Some of the marchers did burn down the court building. They did attack the Ba'ath Party headquarters. They didn't kill anyone, but there was some violence. They even burned down, interestingly enough, the Syria Tel mobile phone company office. Why? Because it's owned by the cousin of President Bashar al-Assad. Everyone knows he had a monopoly and that he's corrupt. And so they targeted that specifically as a sign of their anger at the regime. But in demonstrations after that, which took off in Damascus, which took off in Homs, which repeated in other cities around the country, Deir ez-Zor in the east, they were by and large very peaceful. I myself went to Hama and looked at demonstrations.
I was going to ask you about your visit to Hama.
Yeah. And that was some months later. That was at the end of June. And Ba'ath Party, untouched. Policemen sitting in white plastic chairs in the shade drinking tea as there were demonstrations going on. In Hama again, the court buildings, policemen sitting in white plastic chairs in the shade of trees drinking tea as a demonstration. I mean, there was no violence, and they weren't even worried about violence.
So just remind us, because it seems so otherworldly when looking at the pictures today, how did Syria become such a violent setting?
Well, in a sense, one of my favorite movies from Arab producers is Bab el-Wed City, which is an Algerian movie, and at the end of it, they're talking about the Algerian Civil War of the 1990s, and they said, "Al-unf yunadi al-unf," violence brings on violence. The government, beginning in May and June and July, began to crack down with real force, arresting people, shooting people, regularly firing on demonstrations by May and June, and casualty counts were rising. And eventually, some of the demonstrators organized on their own, either people who had had recent military experience and knew how to fire a rifle, or defectors from the Syrian army. They would put them on the rooftops of buildings near where these peaceful demonstrations were underway. So you would have down on the streets below several thousand demonstrators. When the security forces approached from the north, from the east, from the west, from the south, wherever they were coming from, these men on the roofs would fire at them, at the same time telling the demonstrators they're coming from this side, escape the other way. And it was simply a means of delaying the arrival of the security forces so the peaceful demonstrators could get away. That's where the Free Syrian Army started. It was actually an effort to protect peaceful demonstrations. Now, over time, as the violence escalated, the police began to fire back, more arrests, etc. The people on the rooftops eventually began to attack police checkpoints, police stations, so that by July and August, you had in some places real battles going on between local groups and the Syrian security forces.
August, the President of the United States announces Assad should step aside. How does the internal American debate evolve, so much so that the President adopts this new position?
Many people, well before the President made the announcement in August of 2011, many people were saying, because of the violence that I was just talking about, the Syrian government was inflicting, Assad had lost legitimacy. It was a statement that we were hearing out of some Middle East countries. We were hearing it very loudly from the Syrian American community here in the United States, and there is a very large Syrian American community concentrated in places like Ohio, Illinois, Michigan, California. Even some European countries, Rob, by the end of July, beginning of August, were saying he doesn't really have legitimacy if he has to use this much brute force and kill this many people. Of course, the casualty count then was in the high hundreds, low thousands. Now it's over 200,000. But back then, it seemed very bad. much worse than Egypt, much worse than Tunisia, much worse even than Yemen, we over time began to see that you really couldn't say publicly that Bashar al-Assad, despite this violence that he was imposing, despite the killings, and despite his refusal to discuss anything with the opposition, and the regime refused, we must not forget that he had legitimacy. And the press, you will recall, almost every day was asking the State Department, was asking the White House, how can you say he has legitimacy when he is doing all of these bad things? The last thing the United States government wanted to do in August of 2011 was defend Bashar al-Assad and his tactics.
What about the internal debate about the implications of this? To say that someone should go, and then what would America do to help make him go? I mean, you probably early on understood that unless we put something behind our statements, they will be pretty hollow pretty quick.
Well, I have to be honest, Rob. When the president made the statement, there was no thought in the United States of increasing pressure on the regime in any manner except to increase economic sanctions, which we did. We actually came out with lists of individuals in the Syrian government, especially in the Syrian security police. You know, they have 4 different secret police services in Syria. So we went and named the different high-ranking officials in those services. If they had bank accounts or if they did any kind of transactions with the United States, their assets would be seized. We wanted to increase pressure that way, but I have to be clear with you and with your viewers, there was never a thought in 2011 of using American military power to remove Bashar al-Assad. And in fact, what I was saying to people when I was ambassador there is, do not think that the American Air Force will come. Do not think that the American military will come to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. I kept reminding people that after the American experience in Iraq, which is a very bitter experience, we have to be honest about that, it's a very bitter experience, the thought that the Americans would send their military back to the Middle East to start a new war was just impossible.
Okay.
And we warned the Syrians as much as we could. Even when I went to Hama, I told the demonstrators, you have to stay peaceful. If you become violent, the Americans will not support you, and we certainly will not bring military forces here. And a lot of the Hama demonstrators said, but if the regime attacks us, you have to help us with your military. And I said, don't think we will. Don't make that mistake.
Okay, when we come back, we're going to discuss how the emergence of Daesh and other Islamic forces changes the story in Syria and Robert Ford's own experience inside the State Department in just a moment. My guest, Robert Ford, is a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute. He recently retired from the Foreign Service after serving as American ambassador to Syria, a position that made him the State Department's point man on this hot-button policy issue. That Syria post was the culmination of a 30-year diplomatic career that included postings in Izmir, Cairo, Algiers, Yaoundé, where I lived, Manama, and Baghdad. In addition, Robert served as ambassador in Algeria prior to his appointment to Damascus. Shortly after the outbreak of Syria's civil war, Robert traveled to the city of Hama, as we just heard, in a show of solidarity with Syrians protesting the rule of Bashar al-Assad. He subsequently worked closely with Syrian opposition forces and was instrumental in bringing them to the Geneva peace talks. A native of Denver who now lives in Maryland, Robert was the recipient of a 2012 Profile in Courage Award from the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation for his work in Syria. Robert, we just discussed the early era of the Syrian rebellion. Now Syria is a story of radical Islamist groups fighting this tyrannical regime. Where did the radical Islamist groups come from?
They were coming into Syria even early in the uprising, Rob. we began to see evidence of people from Al-Qaeda in Iraq coming into Syria even as early as the autumn of 2011. There was a bombing in December 2011, two bombings, suicide car bombings of two Syrian Mukhabarat secret police facilities in Damascus. And the way the attacks were done was exactly the same as the way similar attacks had been carried out in places like Baghdad and Ramadi in Iraq. It was very clear evidence that Al-Qaeda people in Iraq were now operating in Syria. So this presence really goes back all the way to almost the start of the Syrian uprising itself. However, in 2011 and in 2012, the vast majority of people fighting the regime were not connected in any way to extremist forces. They were mostly local people who were defending local protesters, as I was talking about. We, during some of our conversations with Syrian opposition people while the embassy was still open, and we were urging, moderation and opening a dialogue with the government, they were telling us there are extremists on the ground who have money and who are able to recruit, to convince young people to join them, because with the money they can buy food, they can buy ammunition, and they can help take care of their families. And they were saying, even in late 2011, Rob, they were saying to us, if you don't help us, eventually these bad guys with money will become the predominant force among the fighting people.
Which is
a prediction which ultimately was correct. It's a dynamic that's actually pretty easy to understand. If you're a young Syrian and you're angry enough to fight the regime, are you going to fight the regime with a group that has few resources, can't give you much ammunition, can't give you any food, can't give you any money to help your family? Or are you going to go with the ones who have more money and can provide you the material with which to do the fight?
Over time, I think it's fair to say, while you labored mightily on behalf of America's efforts, you grew increasingly frustrated.
Yes.
And eventually you left.
I resigned.
You resigned. Why?
In short, Rob, I think our policy goal in 2013 and 2014 was a good goal. It was to get to a negotiation between the government and the opposition. But the tactics that we were using were completely ineffective. The regime was refusing to negotiate, and we were not putting enough pressure on the regime to make it negotiate. The easiest way, from my point of view, to put more pressure on the regime would have been to help the moderate opposition fighting forces. The same people who, on the one hand, were fighting extremists and competing with extremists for young Syrian fighters' loyalties, but were also fighting the regime. Those were the people who would be best able both to put pressure on the regime, keep the extremist problem under control, and ultimately, if there was a political negotiation, it would be those fighting groups that would have to obey the terms of an agreement. But because we didn't help those people, or didn't help them very much, we were never able to generate enough pressure on the regime to get to a negotiation. And you saw the result in January and February of 2014, a year ago, where we all got to Geneva, the regime came, the invitation from United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon to the Geneva talks said in the invitation letter, the purpose of these talks is to implement the Geneva Communique and establish a transition government with full executive authority. When it came time to actually begin discussing it, the regime refused, said, we are not prepared to discuss this. They were in Geneva, but they refused to even discuss what the invitation letter had said was the purpose of the discussions. There was no pressure on the regime, neither from Russia nor enough on the ground. And so the regime could basically simply say, we're not going to play this game, we're not going to do this, and stall. That, to me, suggests that our tactics were ineffective, and that's a national security problem for us now, Rob, because let's go forward now to 2015, about a year later. Now we have extremists in control of all of eastern Syria, except for this little part of Syrian Kurdistan. And they are a threat to Western Europe. We just saw the attack on the grocery store in Paris, which seems to be connected in some way to the Syrian problem. The guy's girlfriend went to Turkey and then into Syria, where the Islamic State is controlled. He himself declared loyalty to the Islamic State.
Robert Ford, thank you very much for joining us.
No, it was my pleasure, Rob. Thank you. Shukran jazeelan.
بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول استراتيجية الأميركية ضد الإرهاب الجهادي، أرجو أن تتصلوا بي مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@alhura.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.